The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca would end every day with a moment of self-examination. He describes it like this: the mind should be summoned every day to render an accounting. Sextius used to do this. At the end of the day, when he had withdrawn to his nightly rest, he would interrogate his own mind. Which of your wrongs did you correct today? Which fault did you resist? In what way are you better? Anger will leave off and be more moderate if it knows that it must come before a judge at the end of the day. Is there anything finer than this habit of searching through the entire day? When the light has been removed and my wife, long aware of my habit, has become silent, I scan the whole day and retrace all my deeds and words. Seneca's nightly routine was an attempt to deal with his own personal shortcoming of a quick temper and overly critical demeanor. He tells us that he would lay awake at night and think about the man he spoke to too aggressively, or the student he critiqued too harshly. He knew it was wrong, and to his credit he wanted to get better. So he would go over those moments where he missed the mark, where he fell short of the man he hoped to be, and he would judge himself, often finding fault. His thinking was, if he knew he would face his own worst accuser at the end of the day, he would be less likely to commit faults tomorrow. He also hoped this practice would make him more mindful of his behavior, also leading to personal growth in this area he struggled with. Seneca's evening routine was nothing more than a more purposeful and structured version of the nightly mind-racing, tossing and turning, fault-finding tour many of us go on just before we fall asleep. I'm not sure why, but the moment after the house is still and the lights have gone out is the moment that all the wrongs of the day are brought to mind. And not just moral wrongs of the day, but things I should have done, or maybe the things I would have been smart to do that I didn't do. You didn't send that email. You didn't mail that check. You didn't go on your run. You ate all those cookies. I may not have much in common with Seneca, but it seems both of us run through the faults of the day just after the lights are out. He did it on purpose, or so he claims. I can't help it. There was one other thing he did just before he allowed his mind to come to rest. After reviewing the faults of the day, he would say to himself, I pardon you, this time. That touching ending to the day, to such a brutal routine, reminds us that being made aware of our flaws is simply not enough. We need pardon, forgiveness, and grace as well. But is self-pardon really enough to ease the sting, and what good does it do for us tomorrow when we must face ourselves all over again? That's what I want to talk with you about. We'll be using Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 to 14, if you want to follow along. The law of Moses is like a shadow of the good things to come. The shadow isn't the good things themselves because it cannot free people from sin by the sacrifices that are offered year after year. If there were worshipers who already have their sins washed away and their consciences made clear, there would be not any need to go on offering sacrifices. But the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sins. It only reminds people of their sins from one year to the next. The author of this letter to the Hebrews tells us that the law of Moses is like a shadow of good things to come. That might take a little explaining. What does he mean by law of Moses? Well, broadly speaking, the law of Moses is a collection of rules given to the people of Israel to govern their lives together. The law was comprehensive, relating to work, love, food, recreation, worship, and other things. The law also addressed moral and spiritual failure and what a person could do to relieve their sense of guilt and shame. That's what the author of Hebrews has in mind here. And we know this because he talks about people who have an awareness of their immorality, what the Bible calls sin, who go to the temple to make a sacrifice for their sins in order to relieve a troubled conscience. The word sin is a translation of the Greek word hamartia. When modern people hear the word sin, they might think that it means to do something wrong, like lie, cheat, or steal. And while the Greek word hamartia certainly includes those types of acts, it's a far more comprehensive concept. The word means to miss the mark. Think of your acts as an archer aiming for a moral target. The bullseye represents your very best self. The rings of the target represent acts and deeds further and further from your best self. When I talk about what sin is with people, they often think of terrible things like cheating on a spouse, murder, or theft. If we stick to our metaphor of the archer and the target, cheating on a spouse or murder is certainly missing the mark. but it's also missing the target altogether. They're not even rings on the board. Such things are hamartia, sin, but so are much less extreme moral actions. Let me give you another example from Seneca. One evening, as he was reviewing his day, he recounted a conversation where he successfully argued the truth, but he did so in such a way that he offended his listener. Rather than being won over by the truth, the listener was hurt and walked away feeling defeated. In his evening reflections, Seneca concluded he was right to argue for the truth, but wrong in the way that he did it. He hit the target, but he missed the mark. Like most people, my life is not full of great big missing the target completely moments. Generally, I hit the target but miss the mark. Rather than making me feel better, these little moments of missing the mark, an unkind word here, an impatient act there, a responsibility unfulfilled, or a commitment quietly forgotten, are the kinds of things that keep me up at night, tossing and turning as I can't help but revisit them over and over again. Just as Seneca felt the need to grant himself a word of pardon, the law of Moses invited the people to come and revisit their moments of missing the mark, of sins great and small. They had to bring a sacrifice as a demonstration of their genuine sorrow at missing the mark, and the priest would pronounce a word of pardon. There was a problem, however. The author says, if there were worshippers who already have their sins washed away, and their consciences made clear, there would not be any need to go on offering sacrifices. There's a twofold problem here. The first problem is that it doesn't seem like the ritual was enough to quiet the unsettled mind. In his own words, it doesn't seem like their consciences were made clear. The words made clear are a translation of the Greek word kathairo, which is where we get the English word cathartic from. If something is cathartic, it means it provides release from mental and emotional anguish. Crying can be cathartic for people experiencing grief. Screaming or hitting a punching bag can be cathartic for people who are angry or stressed. What the author of the Hebrews is saying is that these rituals, where a sacrifice is offered and a word of pardon is spoken, are meant to be cathartic for people whose sense of missing the mark has filled them with guilt and shame. In other words, these rituals were meant to cleanse people from their burden of guilt and shame. But the problem was it didn't work. Or if it did, the effect didn't last. Either the guilt returned or they returned to their sin and restarted the whole cycle. Our reading says there's a reason these rituals don't provide full and final catharsis. They're only shadows of the thing that can provide full and final catharsis. What does it mean to describe these things as shadows? Well, I enjoy sitting on the porch to work or read or just relax. Where I live, we have a high population of large birds of prey, osprey, hawks, kites, heron, and vultures. I love to watch them, and I don't have to sit around with my head craned to the sky. Rather, I work with my head down. Now, these birds cast enormous shadows on the grass and the pavement, and when I see the shadow, I look up. Our reading tells us these rituals of sacrifice and pardon are shadows. And I suspect even those rituals not in the law of Moses, like Seneca's evening ritual, are shadows as well, though of the fainter and less reliable sort. Just as the shadows I see from the porch prompt me to look up to the sky and see what casts the shadow, these little rituals are meant to stir a curiosity in the soul, meant to cause you to look up. Why do I yearn for a word of pardon that lasts? Why do religious ceremonies or nighttime words of pardon delivered in private only give me temporary relief? Where does all this come from? Our reading tells us these shadows are cast by the figure of Jesus. The rituals, both of the law of Moses and of the little coping rituals of the conscience, are shadows of something better. And Jesus is the better thing, who can provide a permanent relief from sin and guilt and shame in a more reliable way. Here's what he had to say. The priests do their work each day. They keep on offering sacrifices that can never take away sins. But Christ offered himself as a sacrifice that is good forever. Now he's sitting at God's right hand. He will stay there until his enemies are put under his power. By his one sacrifice, he has forever set free from sin the people he brings to God. Here's the point. Whether whether the ritual is an ancient priest practicing according to the law of Moses, or Seneca pardoning himself in the midnight hour, or a close friend telling you it's all okay. The very fact that such things have to be repeated over and over again shows that the root problem hasn't been solved. If treatment persists, the disease may be held at bay, but it's not cured. Our author to the letter to the Hebrews tells us that Christ offered a sacrifice once, and our reading tells us it's good forever. Today's Ascension Sunday, the day that the Church celebrates Jesus' ascension into heaven, where he sits at the right hand of the Father. Jesus' ascension into heaven means many things, but one thing it means relevant to our discussion is that his work of pardon, as well as his work of catharsis, and by that I mean relief from guilt and shame, is finished. That's why our reading says that he sits rather than stands. A man who's standing is ready for work, but a man who is seated has finished his work. Our reading is very straightforward. Jesus' finished work has forever set free from sin the people he brings to God. This brings us to a very important point. If Jesus' work is finished, why does sin persist? Why does my mind still race at night, troubled by my many missings of the mark throughout the day? This is a good and honest question. Several years ago, I had the embarrassing experience of being picked up by a mountain rescue. My friend and I had gotten very lost, and the temperatures were plummeting. The food in my backpack froze solid. We had no means to call for help, but fortunately we bumped into 2 members of the local mountain rescue that were training. They guided us off the mountain and insisted on driving us back to the park. From our perspective, we weren't in the clear until we were back in our tents, safe and sound. But the truth is, once we were in the hands of mountain rescue, we were saved. Here's what I'm getting at. A racing mind and a troubled conscience is nothing more than the travel down the mountain. You may not feel fully rescued from your sins, but truly, once you're in the hands of the Savior, you are saved. He has not only ascended, but he's seated. He rules and reigns over all things, including our sin, and he has put it away. Unlike Seneca, whose pardon is only this time, the pardon of Jesus Christ is forever.